Ozcan is the People's Democratic Party, HDP representative to the United States of America. After graduating from the University of Warwick with a sociology degree, he worked at the Center for Turkish Studies in London between 2011 and 2016. He was a founding editor at The Region, an online news outlet covering the Middle East. He has been working with HDP in its overseas representative offices since 2016 and was appointed to be our US representative in September 2017. So Giran, the floor is yours, and we'll have a short Q&A section after you talk.
Okay, hi everyone, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about, well, Baku, which, and Turkey in general, and how it all kind of fits in the whole bigger picture, both in Kurdistan, but in the Middle East as well. And so, you know, without going too much into history, I think, firstly, we do need to talk about what the Kurdish issue in Turkey is and what the Kurdish question in Turkey is, because I know many of you, or probably actually all of you, will have information about what's going on in Rojava, the political project that's being furthered there, developed day by day, and what kind of conditions in Syria actually allowed or brought together the atmosphere and the conditions for something like Rojava to flourish in the first place. Because we have a different set of conditions in Turkey, I do think maybe just to touch upon a little bit about what the conditions in Turkey are, what the historical context is in Turkey. Turkey is defined constitutionally as well is a country for Turks. It is officially a Turkish nation state that constitutionally says that everyone living in Turkey is Turkish. Now, that categorization, Turkishness as a categorization is not just a definition of a citizenship, but it's also an ethnic. It has an ethnic connotation, ethnic definition. For example, there are Turks in Turkey, but there are ethnic Turks outside of Turkey. I mean, according to certain Turkish scholars, there are around 300 million Turks in the world. So Turkishness isn't just a category of citizen. It's not just the population of Turkey. There is an ethnicity named the Turks. They have their languages. They have, you know, they're scattered across Asia, and very many nation states believe that, you know, their ethnic roots belong to this whole Turkic family. And so the Kurdish question in Turkey arises from the Turkish elites that founded the Republic of Turkey in the early 1920s, decided that this ethnic category was to be enforced on everyone living within the modern boundaries of the Republic of Turkey. And this was forcefully done, sometimes physically, in terms of genocidal policies in the early Republic, sometimes culturally, through education programs starting from childhood to, you know, throughout people's lives, banning languages, for example, you know, Kurdishness, anything that resembled Kurdish culture was banned in Turkey for a very long time, and arguably still is today. So the Kurdish question in Turkey differs from the other parts a little bit in the sense that the way the Turkish nation state was formed brought with it specific characteristics in the way the Turkish elites of the founding elites of Turkey tried to build this nation, build its population, build its not just its bureaucratic structures, but also the people that live within those boundaries had to be built, had to be shaped, had to be formed. And the Kurds suffered very much while this project was being undertaken, and still are today. So there were very early resistances to this, quite understandably so. And I won't be talking about all the historical resistances because apparently there's been about 29. I'll talk more specifically about the last one, which by actually a former Turkish president was defined as the 29th Kurdish rebellion against the Turkish state. And that's the PKK, because a lot of the things that we're going to be talking about today, whether it's in Rojava, whether it's in Bakur, whether it's in northern Kurdistan or Turkey, actually come from the PKK's rebellion. And I think this is something that sometimes, I don't know whether it's something we Kurds do when we're presenting our case and what we do generally, or whether this is specifically or purposefully degenerated by observers from the outside. That's something that we can debate later as well. But for some reason, what goes on in northern Kurdistan, what goes on in Rojava, what goes on in Iraqi Kurdistan, what goes on in Iranian Kurdistan, it seems as if each part is not just physically separated by, very fake borders that were, I'm sure every listener here knows those borders were formed about 100 years ago after the First World War and the collapsing of the Ottoman Empire, and how these borders were enforced upon the region. And really did not resemble at all the fabric of the region in itself. And so the way the PKK structured itself from the beginning, the ideology that it adopted while fighting for Kurdish rights is very important to what we're going to be talking about today. Because the PKK took up arms against the Turkish state in '84, and there's been a conflict since, and very many cultural and political entities have formed out of that conflict. Now, I'm the HDP rep here in the US, and the HDP comes from a long line of political parties that have presented the Kurdish case and struggled for the Kurdish cause inside the Turkish political arena, and have had won seats in parliament, have contested elections, have contested local elections, and won very many municipalities. And since the early 90s, predecessors of the HDP have constantly been targeted by the Turkish state. Since the most recent coup in Turkey in 1980, there was a 10% threshold put specifically so that parties like ours could not cross the threshold and represent its constituents in Turkish parliament. So since the early 90s, pro-Kurdish political parties have contested elections, have run for elections, and have scored between around 5 and 8%, I would say, fluctuated between 5 and 8%, the proportion of the vote that pro-Kurdish parties were able to get before. Now, one way of circumventing the 10% threshold was to have independent candidates that would run in the predominantly Kurdish cities. And so there would be a different threshold for independent candidates. But while contesting elections through independent candidates would make the 10% threshold redundant, it would also mean that the party or the vote potential, the electoral potential, would never fully be realized come election time, because you weren't able to run candidates everywhere. So it would be very localized, and it would allow for pro-Kurdish parties to have some sort of representation in parliament, but never the full potential of never the full representation of its potential in Turkey. And in any case, almost every single one of the predecessor parties of the HDP would be repressed and suppressed and ultimately banned by the Turkish state. And that's why we have this long trail of predecessor parties before the HDP. With the HDP, however, and before I get to this, actually, I do need to talk about Abdullah Öcalan, the leader of the PKK, because he has led the movement from day one. And even after this whole international conspiracy, as it's called by the Kurds, which brought together states like the US, like Israel, that came together, and this is all open source, this is not any conspiracy, but this is all open source, where these states came together and actually conspired with Turkey to capture Abdullah Öcalan and hand him over to Turkey in 1999. And even in the early 90s, Abdullah Öcalan's and the PKK's thought would be very much fueled with ideas on the left. The PKK was a Marxist-Leninist party from its outset, and struggled within those ideological parameters. But during the 90s, and especially after the collapse of the Soviet Union, this led the PKK, and specifically Abdullah Öcalan, to rethink a lot of the strategies and a lot of the worldview that the PKK had adopted in its struggle. And this led to a lot of discussions revolving around how best to achieve societal liberation in this new world, post-Cold War. And I believe that led Öcalan to rethink a lot of the party's initial founding columns. And that the creation of a new independent nation state did not necessarily mean the liberation of a people. And starting from that, and especially after 1999, when Öcalan was captured, handed over to Turkey, where he was tried and sentenced to death initially, but then that was commuted to a life sentence, which he's serving in an island prison where he is alone with four other inmates, sorry. So since 99, Öcalan says himself that he found that he was able to read much more than he ever was, and there's a whole list of reading that he undertook in Imralı prison, and Murray Bookchin was one of them. Not the only one, I must add, but Murray Bookchin was one of the thinkers that he was able to read. Others were Emanuel Wallerstein, Fernand Braudel, a lot of historical reading, even anthropologists and archaeologists, André Gunder Frank, a lot of people that reconceptualize history in their own specific ways. And I think this is something that Öcalan has always mentioned when he's provided the Kurdish people with alternative routes to liberation. He's always expressed how much use he's made of, especially writers of history who have, like Fernand Braudel, brought a whole new way of conceptualizing history. And so this, I believe, led Öcalan to think about a lot of the things that he and the movement had done before, to rethink how they did things and adopt a new way in tackling the question of national liberation. And now, while I believe everyone in the committee is familiar with how this has played out in Rojava, probably not very many people are aware of how this is playing out in northern Kurdistan in Turkey, because I would argue that the primary theater of this conflict is Turkey. There are historical reasons for that, which I probably shouldn't get into right now, but just the way that the Turkish nation state was founded has made Turkey the kind of vanguard of the oppression of the Kurds, the vanguard of the suppression of Kurdish demands and political articulations in the region. And that's why the PKK is most active in Turkey, and that's why the conflict's main theater is and has always been Turkey. And that's why even with Rojava right now, what goes on in Turkey is decisive. And again, if we accept the fact that these borders were very unnatural, then it would be very unnatural for us to be limited by these borders as well. And by us, I mean not just us Kurds, but anyone that feels that this struggle, this resistance, this project, this beacon of hope needs supporting. And so what's going on right now in Turkey with this renewed attempt to quash Kurdish political articulation via the HDP is something that we all need to take note of, not just because of all the military incursions that we've seen crossing the border from Turkey into Rojava, attacking the political project and experiment. And actually, I don't think it's an experiment anymore. It's a political project in practice. And Turkey is doing everything it possibly can to ensure that that political articulation in a very, very volatile region just doesn't succeed. And Turkey is doing everything it possibly can to make sure that that just simply doesn't succeed. And in Turkey right now, the HDP is under a renewed effort to be closed down. And the reasons behind this is that with the HDP, with the founding of the HDP, the Kurdish movement in Turkey actually adopted Öcalan's ideas, the ideas that I was talking about earlier about how these transformed after certain readings in İmralı prison. The Kurdish movement adopted these ideas and put them into practice in Turkey. Not very many people know that these ideas were actually initially implemented in Turkey. The conditions for these to flourish may have occurred south of the border in Syria, but the initial place that the Kurdish movement wanted to implement these ideas to transcend this very narrow national liberation methodology that had kind of been, the left's go-to method of national liberation since the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And that project, which the PKK adopted very early in the 80s, the movement came to the realization that this simply had to be transcended, and that national liberation couldn't just mean national liberation. It had to be tied to the emancipation of humanity, because, as I said, from Öcalan's readings, the crisis that we find ourselves in, whether in the Middle East or in Kurdistan, it's a national liberation crisis, whether it's an ecological crisis in every other part of the world, whether it's women's liberation, again, in every other part of the world, all of these oppressions were connected, and that they could only be transcended if the system of oppression that enables all of these exploitations be transcended itself. And that's where the HDP came in. The HDP was the political articulation of a movement that came to the realization that the Kurds could not be free on their own. The Kurds could not be free by targeting or aiming for an institution that had these oppressions and exploitations inherent in the structure itself. And that realization brought the Kurds and the Kurdish political movement to say that, okay, there is an oppression of Kurdish identity, but there are all of these other oppressions as well. And these are all symptoms of or expressions of the same system that is exploiting everything else. And what can we do to bring these forces together, to bring all of these suppressed, oppressed, exploited segments of society together to transcend the system as a whole? Because only if that happens can the Kurdish issue itself be solved too. And one thing that separated this transformation from the classical Marxist idea of, if society, I know I'm oversimplifying it, but just for the sake of trying to keep this as short as possible, is that society won't be free if the working class is free. Society, as Öcalan put it to the PKK, the first oppression was the oppression of women, is Öcalan's claim, very direct claim, is that the first oppression is the oppression of women. And we need to trace the history of oppression to this very initial oppression of women, and make the liberation and emancipation of women at the center of our theory of, or our practice for the liberation of humanity as a whole. And so that's why in the Kurdish movement, you can see that, especially in terms of women's liberation, things have moved forward quite a lot. As in comparison to other things, the liberation of women, both in theory and in practice, has progressed very much relative, at the very least, relative to, you know, other comparative portions of the Middle East, but I would also argue globally too. And so bringing these forces together in Turkey brought about the HDP. The HDP was the first pro-Kurdish political party that was able to construct a platform in which all of these oppressed segments of society were able to come together and articulate a political project that would transcend the way that the current Turkish Republic is organized. And that's why, for example, the HDP doesn't categorize itself as just a pro-Kurdish party. And that's how, qualitatively speaking, it differs from all of its predecessors. And yeah, with this new political platform, the HDP was actually, as a party, able to cross the 10% threshold for the first time in its history, and scored 13% in the 2015 elections. Crossing the threshold automatically meant that the AKP was unable to form a government, because it had lost its majority. Once the HDP was able to fulfill its electoral potential and score this very significant success, gained 81 members of parliament in 2015, which ensured that the AKP no longer had a majority in parliament. Now, as soon as this happened, the crackdown began. Fighting began in Kurdish cities. The Turkish army conducted operations, which up until a couple of months before the election, the AKP government, the Turkish state, was in a negotiation process with the PKK. They were actually sitting down officially and discussing a possible peace process between the fighting sides. And that all collapsed 2 months before the elections. Very, suspiciously, and I think the election results itself show why that process collapsed. The AKP found saving people's lives not necessarily expedient to its electoral ends, and so that process collapsed. The HDP scored this success, and the crackdown started immediately. Fighting started immediately, and since then, the Turkish state's approach to the Kurdish issue has deteriorated, both domestically and outside of its own borders, as you guys are well aware in Rojava too. Now, with this framework, and I definitely don't want to drag on too much longer, because I do believe an interactive session is always better than just someone rambling on. But right now, the Turkish Constitutional Court has started a process of closing down the HDP. I mean, in the last 6 years, we've had thousands of our members imprisoned, members of parliament, our former co-chairs, Selahattin Demirtas and Figen Yüksekdağ, have been in prison for over 4 years. And as I said, the municipalities that we won, they've been taken over by the Turkish state. So for 6 years, the crackdown has been non-stop, yet we are still standing, we are still contesting elections, and from all the polls I've seen, we are still smashing that threshold as well. And so the last choice, the last option that the Turkish government feels it has, is to close the party down. And that process has started, although there was a setback for the government with the Constitutional Court sending back the indictment for some shortcomings in 1 or 2 places, which are technical shortcomings that can be overcome very quickly. And I believe that the Turkish government and the prosecutor that's dealing with the case is already working on that. And I am very much expecting for this process to continue, because the AKP-MHP alliance, which is the alliance in the government right now, it's an unofficial, actually it's an official coalition now, of the ruling, Erdogan's AKP party and the most nationalist, I would say, fascist party in Turkey, the MHP, which is the Nationalist Action Party. And that's also meant a much more nationalistic, a much more racist policy towards the Kurds, but towards all other minorities in Turkey as well. And this deterioration has meant more military offensives against Rojava, more military offensives against the Kurds in Bashur, in Iraqi Kurdistan, against the PKK, and a much tougher crackdown on the HDP. And so, just to wrap it up, right now, we have, we have in Rojava, the political project is continuing. Has been dealt some blows by the Turkish army, who are occupying parts of Rojava and northern Syria right now. And on the other side, you have this Turkish state that is meddling in so many other theaters in the region, who, with this alliance between this ultra-nationalist right-wing MHP and the AKP, a much more Turkish expansionist policy in the region, which is destabilizing the region, but also domestically, it's cracking down on any form of opposition right now. And in essence, if I just go back to the beginning, the way the Turkish nation state was founded, any kind of Kurdish political articulation is a threat to the Turkish nation state's creation story. And that's why, whether, it's the most progressive political entity in the region, or whether it's what's going on in Iraqi Kurdistan, where, a couple of families are controlling all the wealth and power. Any kind of Kurdish political expression and articulation is a threat to the Turkish nation state, and they will not stop anytime soon. And just how the Turkish nation state doesn't recognize any borders when it wants to quash Kurdish political articulation, I believe it necessary that we, as people that support the political entity and the political project that's going on in the region, led by the Kurds and specifically the PKK, and I need to say this, even as the HDP rep, this is, and I think we can have that discussion in the interactive part as well, and I'll be happy to explain how this is led by Abdullah Öcalan and the PKK, and why that shouldn't be a taboo anymore. And I'm well aware that I'm sitting here in Washington, DC and saying this, but this, I think at this stage, just has to be said from now on. So just like these powers that want to quash the project don't recognize borders, I think we shouldn't either. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Giran. So the floor is open. I guess we can take stack in case there are a lot of questions. Yes, applause, Sergio and Özlem, yes. Yeah, just raise your hand or write in the chat, stack. Dana, are you raising your hand? Oh, you're muted. Dana, did you raise your hand?
Okay, I have a practical question. Does anyone have a better way of translating the essays than Google Translate?
What essays? You mean from Turkish into
Uh-huh.
English? I'm afraid Google Translate is the best at the moment. I don't know what other thing.
Okay.
What other thing? I use it a lot myself. Never perfect, but it works.
Okay.
Uh, if I could start out, so again, Mr. Ozcan, thank you so much for your presentation, and I have a few questions, but I'll go one for the time being. Uh, what we could say that the inside the Turkish political system, in terms of the thresholds, you know, the 10%, what we could say that the wild card of Turkish, sorry, the wild card of women across ethnicity within Turkey. I mean, if you're thinking about someone like Figen Yüksekdag, you know, who is not Kurdish, and to what extent within the political articulation of the Democratic Confederalist ideology, which is not ethnic specific, which can be, you know, applied to everyone, which has a certain grounding among communities in the Middle East outside of the Kurdish ethnicity. To what extent can that be a mobilizing factor, for example, including in electoral politics within Turkey, you know, even for Turkish women, as well as women of other minorities, to that, for the HDP message to appeal to them in terms of countering this MHP, AKP kind of fascistic, you know, Sunni Turkish mentality. So what can you say about that?
Should I go for an answer? Should we do one by one? Yeah, okay.
Yeah, we can do definitely one by one.
Perfect. Okay, because I mean, firstly, democratic confederalism doesn't reject representative democracy, but definitely transcends representative democracy. And I, for one, have never seen the HDP as as an organizer of democratic confederalism, because I think that the organization of democratic confederalism has to be organized outside of the current political structures, the current, at least representative political structures, to be more clear. But saying that, you're absolutely right. I think the democratic confederalism as an ideology, as an approach, as an organizing ethos, motivates a lot of the cadre of the HDP, and that has an impact on messaging. That has an impact on just, you know, your worldview and how you operate and how you convey to people what you want to be doing. At the end of the day, the HDP is a political party contesting elections, so that means it wants to take power in Turkey. It wants to run the government in Turkey, and so the Democratic Confederalist project definitely not just motivates, actually animates the cadre of the HDP in going to all parts of Turkey and explaining that the issues at hand, the problems that we as the HDP believe we have a solution for, are ones that have an impact on every single one of our lives, whether we are a man, a woman, gay, lesbian, worker, every single person who has a bone to pick, or who has an issue with this system, who is either exploited or disregarded by this system at hand, we believe that we have a solution to, and that this message can resonate with not just Kurds in Turkey, but with everyone. Hopefully that answered the question a little bit.
Sorry, just very quickly, quick follow-up, but the gender component of that, appealing to Turkish, even ethnic Turkish women, based on the ideology, which is one of the most gender progressive ideologies in the world, if not the most. And how can that play with women who are not Kurdish, and that could really change the numbers electorally?
I don't know how I can best answer that. I can answer that from my experience as a Kurdish man. Just looking around, I've definitely found that this project, even if you don't highlight specifically the gender component, has much more of an impact on, from what I've seen, on women than it has on men in Turkey. And I don't know how that comes across, to be honest, but, and I'm talking from experience, I just think that the gender component is so central to the whole argument that it just has an impact more on the most oppressed component of society, and according to Öcalan, that is women. And so an ideology that believes that only that most oppressed component of society's liberation can liberate the whole of society, that being more appealing to women is something that is understandable to me, to be honest.
We have Arthur next.
Yeah, thanks. And yeah, first of all, I just want to say thank you, Giran, for taking the time to be with us. It's such a privilege to have you. I wanted to speak to something which you mentioned near the end of your talk, which was, in your words, the sort of taboo of the PKK kind of being the elephant in the room. And I was wondering if you could elaborate on your thoughts on this taboo, to just jump straight into it, the relationship between the HDP and the PKK. It seems that on the one hand, right, you just have the undeniable reality that there is this broad, rich movement that's born out of the Kurdish liberation movement and informed by PKK and Öcalan, and the HDP can't be separated from that history and that reality. And on the other hand, you sort of have this reality in which the Turkish state is very much weaponizing the existence of the PKK and oversimplifying that truth and that relationship. And I'm wondering both your thoughts on the HDP's position and sort of strategy in practical terms on navigating the distinction and the relationship, both in its implications for HDP's strategy, but also its implications for broader international solidarity strategy, especially those of us in the United States, right, a country in which the PKK is officially listed as a terrorist organization. This is a big elephant in the room when we're trying to navigate how to most effectively exert, power and show solidarity. So any of your thoughts on this, I would so appreciate. Thank you.
Thank you for the question, because I've been in DC now for almost 4 years doing what I do as, I'm the HDP rep. But I'll start off with this sentence. The PKK, from what I've seen, is arguably a bigger taboo in DC than either Al-Qaeda or Taliban. This has been so astonishing to me that there are people in DC right now who are trying hard to take affiliates of Al-Qaeda off the terrorist list in the US. You can actually go and do that in DC. People are doing it. They're actually doing it publicly. They are trying very hard to get Al-Qaeda affiliates in Syria off the list so that the US can engage with them very openly. And people make, very smart arguments. You probably won't be surprised that such terrible ideas are articulated so intelligently in DC. And I would say this is one of them. But when you come to talking about the PKK, oh my God, is that a taboo? You simply can't. I don't think you can't see anyone in DC talking about this huge elephant in the room. I've said this in DC before, arguably the US conducted one of its most successful operations in the Middle East with the PKK. Go on then, they can argue as much as they want with me. My address is open. They can come and speak to me. What I mean by this. I don't think. If you remember, in the first few years, off the podium here in DC, in the State Department, or even in the White House, everyone would make the distinction, right? The YPG isn't the PKK. The SDF isn't the PKK. I don't think people are really trying to make that distinction very much anymore. Even the Americans, especially the ones I speak to, not publicly, I mean, they know who they're dealing with. They know who they're speaking to. They know this very well. I think in the last 6 or 7 years, we've seen that when it comes to state interests, acronyms can be, very fluid, to say the least. And so with us, though, with the HDP, again, this is all open source publicly. Öcalan was meeting with his lawyers in 2010, 2011, to the point of actually determining what the HDP should be called. He is the person who formulated the whole framework for the HDP. I'm saying this is the HDP rep, and this is not a very well kept secret. Abdullah Öcalan gave the party its name, let alone its whole framework and how it should be appealing to other portions of society, what kind of formally preventative or formally ideological obstacles needed to be overcome for the HDP to be a much more successful political party contesting elections in Turkey. These were all said around a little table on İmralı Island, and they're all in a book you can all buy. Öcalan was saying these in 2010, 2011. Actually, even to the point of giving HDP electoral tactics. This is all open source. Now, what the Turkish state is trying to say is that the HDP is run by the PKK, which is simply not true. PKK operates in a completely different domain, the HDP in a completely different domain. It would be both equally funny and unrealistic to believe that the PKK can run the HDP just as much as the HDP couldn't run the PKK's guerrilla war. That it's just simply two different domains, two different operating theaters. But one thing does bring them together is how Öcalan almost single-handedly gives them their theoretical openings, gives them their theoretical framework. Now, I know this in itself is sometimes a bit of a taboo discussion within progressive and left circles. Is this just a one-man show? Is he a Stalinist? Is he this authoritarian figure that just determines everything? Well, that's simply not the case as well. Yes, he has a huge charisma, leadership charisma, and both in the PKK, but in the Kurdish population as well. Now, whether that's deserved or not, again, completely different discussion that we can have some other time, but this is what it is right now. And so the accusations that are brought against the HDP by the Turkish government are just, they want to close down the HDP. So they say the PKK runs the HDP. There's absolutely no evidence for this whatsoever, and they can't bring it up anywhere. But for us outside, for example, for me here in the US, where you'd think I'd have to kind of be very careful on the kind of things I say, but I think I've mentioned off a stage in one of the think tank conferences, I can't remember exactly which one, but I said the HDP was a grandchild of the PKK, and this is recorded and I'm saying it again. At the end of the day, there's this Kurdish political movement that started off as a Marxist-Leninist organization for Kurdish national liberation and has now transcended that in so many ways that has become, and I think a lot of even American policy makers and thinkers here in DC accept, that has become one of the most progressive forces in the whole of the Middle East. Now, for this to not be articulated in different parts of Kurdistan or different parts of the Middle East is, I would say, it will find a way to articulate itself. And I think the HDP is one of these articulations. Rojava is another articulation. This actually falls within the parameters and framework of democratic confederalism as well, because a solution to the Kurdish issue might not necessarily be the same in each part of Kurdistan. And democratic confederalism is sensitive of regional and local differences and contexts. And that's why where in Rojava you have cantons, in Bakur, in northern Kurdistan, you might have a different solution to the Kurdish issue, and democratic confederalism allows for this to happen. There is an internal logic to all of this, and these articulations can occur. For us outside of the country, right, this terrorist organization list is a minefield, definitely. I mean, it's a law. And so, I've had a lot of experience with this about what I can say and what I can't say. Or in Turkey even, can, for example, a political party stand for everything that the PKK stands for, but just not do it violently. If, for example, what does the PKK stand for in Turkey? Very simplistically, in the most simplest form, Kurdish rights, language, local governance. Can you actually demand these in Turkey right now peacefully? You simply can't. You can't. There was an example just a couple of weeks ago, a former HDP member of parliament who separated his ways now. His name is Altan Tan. He was on a mainstream Turkish TV channel in which he was asked by the moderator, what is the Kurdish issue? And as he was going to give a list of what the Kurdish issue was, the first thing he said was the ban on the Kurdish language has to be removed. As soon as he said that, the other program participants jumped at him and said, oh my God, you can't say that here on TV, that's PKK propaganda. So, that's just one anecdote. But here in the US, for example, I don't know if there are any law students or lawyers who are listening to us, but could you actually support or demand everything that the PKK was demanding for, everything that the PKK program states, without being violent? Would that be illegal in itself? Don't praise violence, don't be violent, but theoretically and vociferously stand up for everything that this movement is standing up for. I don't see why not. If there are any lawyers or law students listening to us right now that can tell us otherwise, I'd be very happy to listen.
Thank you. Any other questions, comments? Going once? Well, it was very informative, so probably people are overwhelmed with the new information.
I have a question. I just, and forgive my ignorance on this, but are there any avenues of political pressure that are possible against the oppression of the HDP, especially in what's happening with them trying to dismantle the party?
I mean, we do a lot here in BC to try and get, it's actually a little shameful about just how little the US government does when it comes to the Kurds in Turkey and when it comes to the HDP. But we're trying to get statements from the White House, we're trying to get statements from the State Department. And generally, we're finding that even when they do make statements, it's just an expression of concern, which is unfortunate. So, I think we've had more luck with Congress, but that's the thing with the HDP representation and mission here in the US, that it is very limited to just DC institutions, whether that's government or think tank. And that's largely because of the laws that kind of regulate how a foreign political party can operate here in the US. But I do think outside of DC, solidarity work can be actually more effective, because what we've seen for example, when it comes to Rojava, we saw that public pressure can actually do a lot, can have a big impact. Even on someone like Trump, when in October 2019 he moved the American forces out of the way of the Turkish occupation, I think he got a lot of backlash from the public, and that's one of the main reasons why he had to backtrack. And we didn't see Trump backtrack on a lot of things, even the most horrific of stuff. But yeah, on this issue, he very publicly backtracked on this decision. And so I do think that somehow, and I know this is difficult, but somehow we need to raise this awareness more in the US. And I think one thing we do have going for the Kurds is that the American public doesn't necessarily have to be very well informed about the internal political Kurdish projects and the Kurdish political parties that are operating in Kurdistan. The key word which I found has been good to me here in DC has been just Kurds. And so, I mean, I think of very many members of Congress that I meet don't meet me because I'm the representative of the third largest political party in Turkey. They meet me because I'm Kurdish and a representative of a pro-Kurdish party. And that seems to be the key word that unlocks a lot of doors for me here in DC. And I think that could be something that we, as people who would rather try to make this a more public issue here in the US, is that, you know, largely thanks to what happened in both Syria and in Iraq, in Bashur and Rojava, and how the Kurds really took the fight to ISIS. I think that has gained, or at least informed a lot of the American public on what the Kurds are, who the Kurds are, where they live. And I think that's something that we as progressives and as people that want to gain solidarity and do more solidarity work can make use of.
Thank you so much. Okay, we have a question. Another practical question: was the best way to get donations for Rojava? I don't know if that's a question for you, Giran. I can share a link later on when we discuss Rojava. Okay, if there are no other questions, it could be a good time to stop and move on to our Rojava update. But thank you so much for coming to talk to us and for your informative talk.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for having me and giving me the opportunity, and good luck with everything you do.
Thank you so much.
Really grateful.
Thank you. Thanks for coming.
Thank you so much.
Take care.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you. Bye-bye.